Hello and welcome to Tails Technical Demo 4. This one is about the data binding framework which I built in TypeScript specifically for Tails. Okay, well, why did I build my own? Why didn't I just use one of the various options that are out there? So I looked first at Angular being the most popular, I believe, still today. Angular apps require you to marry your web technology in with Angular. It is a built Angular app from the beginning. They say that you should not try and untangle Angular from your web app once you have it, and you can't easily put Angular into a web app that is already existing. I don't like this kind of marrying of these two technologies. The chances of Angular being the best one forevermore is unlikely, just by time, how that works. So I didn't want to do that. Aurelia is very similar. Also, you need the CLI to even run your application, and that just seems like hard work. And I can't remember why I didn't like React, but it was probably a similar reason. Anyway, I decided to build my own. I thought it might be quite an interesting project to take on, and I'm going to show you some of the bits about how it works. First, let's talk about what I want from my data binding framework. So I'm looking at this from two angles. From the server side, I just want to serve JSON. I don't care, I just want to serve data. I shouldn't have any knowledge on the API about what the UI is, because the API is going to serve apps and whatever else. It doesn't want to know, it mustn't know. Which means all the interface is getting, all the web page is going to get is some JSON. Nothing more or less than that. On the front end side, as I am writing my HTML, I want it to be quite intuitive and easy to read. I want the tags to be standard HTML. I want the attributes to be intuitive about what they are. So how is that going to work structurally? On screen now, you can see a scribble on paint.net that I put together to try and demonstrate what I mean. On the left, imagine you have your HTML page with various elements on it, and on the right, a JSON object, which could be created locally or sent from an API, it doesn't matter. We have a number of properties, and we need to map them onto elements. I create a binding between every single property and element pair that comes along. So the situations I need to make sure work is when you have a property mapped to an element, where one property is mapped to two elements. That has to work as well. I need it so that two properties can be mapped to one element as well. And of course, collections, I need to be able to handle a list. Also, not on this diagram, I need to handle more complex objects where the property is an object itself and has child properties as well. Okay, let's see it in action. I've set up a test page here with some of the skeleton code ready for us to get started, so you don't have to see the whole lot. Let's fire that up. Here you can see we have a title and then a few other bits which we are going to fill in with some data binding code using my stuff. The HTML for it I shall show you in Visual Studio. It's as simple as we're going to enhance this and do the data binding. Okay. First thing we need to do is this page requires the data binding stuff. So for the bundler I have here, I need to declare that dependency. If you were paying attention on one of my previous videos, you will remember this bit. So what is this? The client data bind. Oh wow, that's not what I meant to type. Client data binding bundler. That's a guess. Lovely. There we go. So now we have that working in there as well. Now, let's start with actually the data model. You see that we need a title, we need some text, we have a collection going on, and then an input and a button. So let's just start straight out with the title. Here is the view model where it's just a simple class. I keep the root element so that I can keep that to hand if I need that later as well, which sometimes happens. And I call the initializer to bind the root element with the view model. We'll take a look at what that code actually does in a bit. For now, we're just going to define some extra properties. So we said there was a title, which is a string. We also, we'll leave it at just the title for now. We can say in here, if we want an initial value that can equal, we'll call it Rick, and there we go. We have our first property in there. Now, here in our CSHTML, we need to bind this element to that property. Now, we don't want any of that text inside, although we can leave that there if we like. What we do is, this will look familiar to Aurelia users. Text.bind, title was the name of the property, right? So it's that property. And it is as simple as that. Rick. Now, let's go this step by step a little bit without going through too much of the code yet. We have the component that's brought in, so all of the data binding stuff is brought in. And then when the DOM is loaded, we add a view model to the document, which is a new test page view model, which is exactly what this is. So we've got a new one of those, and then we call its initialize method, init method. The init method is just what we have here, where we say, hey, tell me what the root element is for the binding. In this case, I chose the body element. I set the property, and then I call bind. All right. Straightforward enough. That's how that works. So we can straight away jump in, and we can also put the text in. This is some text to demonstrate data binding. Let's move a step forward. Oh no, we have to put that one in there. So the text for this guy is bound to the property called text. Next, let's demonstrate the binding for the list here. So to bind a list, you want to use the collection binding, and we'll call this one lyrics. And let's build that property now first, so that we know what we're looking at. So a property called lyrics, which can be an array of, we'll just say any for now. Obviously we'd better type it in for real, but it'll do. This dot lyrics equal to, let's just initialize it straight out. Let's have an object with an ID of 1 and text of that. And we'll have a second one, an ID of 2 and text of that. Okay, so we have two items in our lyrics collection here. One with a property named ID. Let's keep the capitalizing uniform, shall we? Property of ID and text. So in here, in our template, in HTML5, there's a template element. So I use it. You give it an ID, so that would be a lyric template, I suppose. And in here, we would have a list item, and the text bind would equal text, was it? Honestly, there we go. Would be text. Now you can have multiple templates in here, so this binding is a little bit more interesting in that you also provide the template name in there as well. It looks like Voodoo at the moment, but I'll show you in a little bit. And let's get rid of these other ones. We don't want those there. Alright, this is a good place to take stock, see what we've got. Title, text, and a collection of lyrics. Look what we have. Rick. This is some text to demonstrate data binding and some lyrics. Okay, it works. Wonderful. There's two more things to show, which is two-way binding and then an event. So let's do that. Now here, let's get rid of this default value in here. Value.bind. We'll say that's user input out of wonderful originality. So that's the property value, as always. That's going to be a string. And there we go. Now in here, if I inspect this element here, you can do a look at its bindings. It's a collection that is made in the process of the data binding. And there is one, which is a value binding, and we see that there. You can have a little inspection. Let's make this a little bit bigger if we can. And in here, you can see property name is user input. And there is one particular useful, which is get view model value. It's undefined. That's what we'd expect. Well, hello there. Now what's the view model value? Well, hello there. That binding's view model value is that. Now we can potentially get there a different way. We can use context shift binding. Talk about that in a little bit. The context object, that's the view model. So you can jump all the way back here and you can see all the properties of the view model. You see things have underscores here. That's a bit of the inner workings of how the data binding works. But you can see the values sitting under there, as you would expect. Well, let's say we don't like the title. Yeah. Changes. Okay, that's our demonstrated. Last thing here is the button. To bind up a button properly, use click bind. Now you can define your own JavaScript method, I suppose, on the page or whatever, but if you use the click bind, it's attached to the view model that this particular one is connected to. So let's call this my click. Let's alert this dot user input. Keep that open just for transparency's sake. Whoop whoop. Sing along. Whoop whoop. Okay. There's more I can demonstrate, but this proves enough to get us going. How does this all work? I'm not going to go into every detail. It's also not a completely complete, foolproof, perfect product. It works for what I need at the moment. There are certainly improvements that can be done. A lot of the work is done in this static method, bind. That's how everything gets started. You choose your root element, you choose your root view model, and then you go through that element and all its children looking for .bind attributes, and then you marry that up to the correct binding. What is a binding? They are sitting over here on the right, if you can see. Open this bindings folder. Here are all the different kinds of binding that I have made or needed to make so far. Let's quickly go through the base types. So there is just a flat out default binding which has property name. Oh, I haven't mentioned converters. There are also converters, so you can turn a true into a red, for example. And some bits to dispose to try and keep the memory consumption completely under control. And you have a one-way binding, which just has the element update function forcing that to be implemented in all inheriting classes, and two-way binding, which is a one-way binding with extra bits, and that just has a viewModel update function which has to be implemented. Straightforward enough. There is also the one-way HTML binding, which is just a sort of, the one-way binding doesn't actually have to be in HTML. You can use this data binding framework in code. So you can create a binding in code to a particular property and have a callback function, and it will do your callback function whenever that property changes, as you would expect as normal. So you don't have to marry it to the HTML if you do not want to. Here we put together the viewModel property info. So that's when you've got, remember with this binding here, the collection bind, the first property is always the name, and after that you have a list of extra things. Different bindings require different things. The collection binding requires a template name, for example. The click bind, you can change whether the click method is going to be on the viewModel itself, the root object, or on the local data object. I've actually only ever used the viewModel. I've decided since making that your code should be on your root viewModel, and your data objects from there should just be data objects. So far that has made absolute sense. Maybe I will come to a point where it does not, but that has not happened as of yet. Let's take a look at one of these bindings. The text one is probably the simplest. It was the first one made. It is a one-way binding. I preserve the inner HTML of the element that it is given as the default value. Then there is an initial element update function across all of them where I apply the text, which is this guy down here. Set the value to the binding's viewModel value, because I'm setting the value of the element to the viewModel's value. Great. Set to default, restore, element update function. That's the public one that is called automatically by the binding, and it's called twice, so I pulled it out. Picking another one, maybe the value one, which is a two-way HTML binding. In here we are mostly looking for the get attribute value, but you can see, depending on the type of element it is, it will clean it in a different way. Date strings have to be cleaned in JavaScript because JavaScript's a pain with dates. The month number is different, and the date number apparently by the looks of that. Yep. Anyway, click binding. This is a fairly straightforward one by the looks of it. We've got event listeners on the click for that element because it is a click binding, and the bound function, the function that is given to it, is called with the local context object. So what that means is my click in here, let's say we were in a collection like this guy here. We had our list item, so you could have a button click bind in here, do things, and do things here in the viewModel code. You would get given an item which would have been one of these, so you know which one is going to be clicked. Okay, so that's the bindings there. There are some converters as well. Dates to string, counts to boolean, you know, if there are 0 items, show there are no items returned, that kind of thing. A generic string format converter, null to boolean, in case I'm expecting a null, I return a true or false. Yeah, it's actually worked quite wonderfully so far. Like I said before, it is not perfect, but it's a success, and yeah, it's been actually quite wonderful to work with. So now we know what a binding is. We know that the initializer goes through all of the attributes in the HTML page and creates new bindings out of those. We need to then put on the other side of the binding the property of the context object that the data binding has married to that section of the page. So this work is done by this little sort of static class. Ensure field is a property. So essentially what we do is we modify the JSON object and we take the property that it is, save it as a private field, which is just the same name with an underscore in front, and we replace the public field with a getter and setter. And you can see here, this is what it gets redefined as: return the private field, set, replace the private field, and use the event manager to notify the event that this property has changed. And that is how we know that the data has changed on a data object, the JSON object, and then can update the page appropriately. In fact, let's show you the main website itself. We can go through some of the bindings that are there. So over to the research tool, waiting for the API separate application to build. Okay, so in here we're going to go through the events that are delivered first. You can see this list here. That's wonderfully formatted. Let's see if I can, not that one. Okay. So we can see there is a list of objects, all about the same: ID, title, date, location keys. All right. Now if you look here, if I hover over one of these events on the left, you can see the map pin highlights. If I hover over the pin, all the relevant ones there highlight. So let's take a look at this item here. He's got a click bind, a hover bind, with a funny named property, class bind, same property. How interesting that might be, because we are talking about, here's the hover binding, the property is called isHovered, but it was never sent in from the server. It is a user interface only property. All I have to do is specify it here, and it generates it. With the hover binding itself determines the value. If it is hovered, it's true. If it is not hovered, it's false. But it creates the property isHovered on the JSON object, on the JavaScript object that's been sent down. In addition, the map works not by putting HTML elements on it. You use JavaScript to interface with the OpenLayers map. You can give it some GeoJSON, as we discussed in a previous video, but if you want to draw things like pins, it's script time. So this is why I produced the code bindings. So there is a code binding on the collection for drawing the pins, and isHovered links to them both. Okay, I think that about sums it up for the data binding framework. I hope you've enjoyed that. It was a lot of fun and a bit of stress to build, but it's actually got a really good result to it, and it is lovely to use. Absolutely lovely. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.